So in this video I want to have a look at columns, and it will be a focus on the Corinthian Order of Architecture developed by the Greeks, but how this Greek form not only influenced later civilizations and cultures all across the world up until the very, very modern era, but also how, well, the Eastern influence on the Greeks, then the Greeks influenced the East, but of course, as even the Greek and Roman writers make clear, that they learnt much of their science and thinking, timekeeping, etc., from the Egyptians. So it's how the Greek forms also incorporate Egyptian forms of architecture and themes. It's a very interesting because it's not just about ancient history, about ancient traditions and what these people far, far away thought and how they design things, but it's also how these influences influenced other ancient societies, and this influence carried through time up until even past, for instance, the Gothic period into the Renaissance and the Neoclassical period, but also how Greeks, Buddhist, Islamic, Egyptian architecture forms this long story of one influencing another, incorporating another's forms. It's a very important part of our modern and ancient history. Beginning in Athens, here in the center of the picture you can see the Acropolis, upon which the very famous Parthenon is built. Just to the towards the bottom right corner is the site of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, very, very important as well. But there are two other very significant sites in Athens which have had a huge impact on especially esoteric architecture and design. Public buildings, whether it's in the US, the Capitol building, in Washington, Supreme Court building, but across the world, St. Paul's Cathedral in London would be another example. And those two structures are the Tower of the Winds, as it's known, or also the tragic monument of Lysicrates. And we'll examine this a little bit further. It doesn't really need an introduction, but the Parthenon atop of the Acropolis is an amazing building in so many aspects, whether it's in regards to its orientation, the geometry and mathematics and measurement embedded in there, but often overlooked also is the magnificent stonework of the Acropolis. There are no right angles on the building. It would appear that each block is a square block and it's been laid down. Each piece of the Acropolis is tailor-made to it. There are no straight lines. Much is made of polygonal walls, which have clearly been fitted together in an individual form, and rightfully so, gather a lot of attention. However, the Parthenon, which appears to be made of squared rectangular blocks, is actually individually fitted with subtle curves across the building. The building itself, whether it's the platform or the structure, is ever so subtly curved to give, essentially using optical illusions to create effects throughout the building. So whether it's the stonework, orientation, the geometry, and many other aspects, the Parthenon must rank amongst, if you just simply research it, fantastic building in regards to these ancient mysteries, the beauty and mystery of the stonework as well. Again, individually fitted stones, because the curves are so subtle, in many aspects superior to the famed polygonal walls. This is the Temple of Olympian Zeus, and from the photograph you can see the Acropolis and the Parthenon in the background. Temple of Olympian Zeus is also an amazing structure, very important structure. It was begun in the 6th century BC, originally designed to be built along the lines of the Doric Order of Architecture. With the overthrow of a tyrant, it sat incomplete for over 360 years. Then there was, beginning with the Roman era, essentially it was finished by the Romans under the Emperor Hadrian, and by that time it was designed along Corinthian Order of Architecture. One of the reasons why it was begun in the 6th century and why it wasn't completed by Greeks later, because the building was so big and so magnificent they thought it was actually a bad idea to build on such a scale. And if you read Vitruvius and Pliny, and these other writers, and when they talk about the mentality of building and how a lot of these actual great buildings were frowned upon by the people because the expense, because of the labor and the sacrifice that went into building these temples. It's a interesting aspect in regards to that history, which would apply also to many other parts of the world. Structures such as these are very expensive, very difficult to make, and without clear records would probably take a lot of lives as well, because the work and safety standards were not the same as what they are today. But the Temple of Olympian Zeus, very important, and one of the main importance reasons for it is because of its size, but also because of its design. So apart from the sheer scale of the building, one of the most important features of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, completed during the reign of the Roman Emperor Hadrian and begun in the 6th century BC, was that it was the first major temple to be built with Corinthian order columns. Now, columns are not the only expression of the Corinthian order, because we have, for instance, the three Greek orders, Doric, Ionic and Corinthian. The way they are designed and the ornamentation that goes with it is also part of the order. Now, for instance, a Doric temple, pure Doric temple, is very simple with very minimal decoration. Ionic temples would have sculptures and other more elaborate decorations, and when you get to the Corinthian order, the building, basically almost every flat face would have some sort of decoration, and very elaborate decoration. But the Temple of Olympian Zeus, the first major temple to be built with essentially Corinthian order columns, or under the Corinthian order school of architecture. However, it's not the first temple or structure, I should say. It's not the first structure of importance in regards to the Corinthian order, and there are other major sites around the world, but two of them in Athens, which are much smaller, and because of that they're overlooked, but their influence and their importance is huge. And that is, the first of those is the Choragic monument of Lysicrates. Here we see, with arrow points to where the Choragic monument is, and we see an older photo of it in the bottom right hand corner. That's the Corinthian order capital on top of the columns in the Temple of Olympian Zeus. But it's actually the Choragic monument, this much smaller, and because it's again not massive, wouldn't gain much attention because it's not magnificent. However, its importance is huge, and its importance and its influence actually rivals or overshadows many of these major larger temples, which rightfully get a lot of attention. However, they are offshoots and developments from, for instance, this Choragic monument in Athens. Here we see some photos of recently from the Choragic monument, and there we can see the top portion. So on the top left corner we can see the top portion, and a more recent photograph of the Choragic monument. Why it is so important and influential: it was the first structure such in the Greek era to use Corinthian order decorations on the outside of the building. There were some earlier temples which would have a single Corinthian order column in the very middle of the temple sanctuary. However, it was the first to have these on the outside, and this Choragic monument would go on again to be very influential, especially in the esoteric world. For instance, you can see it on Masonic tracing boards, and the influence in other regions as well, where we have the importance of the three Greek orders, Doric, Ionic and Corinthian. I will place links in the description from previous videos where I discuss Doric, Ionic and Corinthian order architecture. The importance of the Choragic monument can be seen in its many replicas. This is one here in the Botanical Gardens here in Sydney. There are several others across the world, but also how on many large public buildings, etc., you will see the Choragic monument built in there significantly. But also the influence of Corinthian order architecture, and the Choragic monument is one of the prime examples of that. This will also link to another very important structure in Athens, which because of its size again is overlooked, and that's the Tower of the Winds. We'll examine that a little bit more in as we go along in the video, but The Tower of the Winds and the Choragic Monument are linked because they're actually both of the Corinthian Order of Architecture, but in the Tower of Winds style of Corinthian, we can see where the Greeks have gone retro and incorporated the ancient Greek style, sorry, ancient Egyptian column decoration style based on the lotus. So on the right we see a close-up of the column capital. Now it's not a actual column, it would be more like, I don't think it would qualify as a pilaster, I'm not sure of the exact term for it, but it's like a column that's built into the wall. But on the left hand side we see a close-up of the capital, and around the base you'll see some curled leaves, and then we have those swirls at each corner which are called volutes. Uh, this school of architecture, how it will relate through the Tower of the Winds, which was built later, and then how the Tower of the Winds school is actually, again, a retro nod of the head to Egyptian architecture. These are one of the plaques attached to this replica here in Sydney, but at the top you'll see this decorative form. It's a tripod. It's not it's three-cornered. That's because this Choragic monument were erected to celebrate victory at the Temple of Bacchus, which was in regards to a particular drama, essentially a play. Back in those festivals at those times, just like in the early modern Olympics, architecture, poetry, and some of these other disciplines were actually at competition level in the earliest modern Olympiad. In the older Greek world, it wasn't just sport, it was mixed with these other arts, crafts, and disciplines, and that was this highly celebrated, and that was the reason why this tragic monument was built, and the tripod placed on top, that was the victory, and really the monument itself was just a plinth for this tripod, this victory. On the left we see the Tennessee Capitol State Building, on the right the Merchants Exchange in Philadelphia. You might, keen-eyed people might notice the link to that and the United Grand Lodge of England building. But the architect of both of these, William Strickland, was a very important, very influential person who also designed some significant Masonic temples as well. And he's one of these historic architects who have the contracts that they got were very important, and the positions that they had were very important, and it would be a long discussion on that, but there have been still practicing now, but also in the past, certain key architects who know their business and get the big jobs and do the very important buildings, not just random copy-paste, but bespoke buildings. On the top of this Tennessee Capitol State Building, Merchants Exchange building in Philadelphia, we have replicas of the Choragic monument there. Now, of course, they've added glass to it, and what they're missing is the tripod on top of those. But these are just a couple of examples of how influential this Choragic monument was, and especially in connections to very important buildings in terms of the historical value of the architecture, but also the connections again to the more esoteric organizations and creations, and just the esoteric in general. Very important connections historically in the symbolism, and of course evidently in this very expensive architecture. The influence that the Choragic monument has had, the placement of Corinthian Order architecture, and which is most easily identified by the capitals, those parts on top of the columns, is quite clear and evident, and hundreds and hundreds of examples could be used. However, let's look at a few. St. Paul's Cathedral in London, very important building by Christopher Wren. We saw a movement away from Gothic and a return to neoclassical. There are different names for the school, but classical architecture, and there we can see the Corinthian columns there at St. Paul. St. Paul's, very important building. Another very important building, just like St. Paul's, could be described as a center of power, is the US State Capitol building. in the front at the entrance, but there also on the dome. You can see that these columns, even the pilasters above them, are of the Corinthian order. There's one example on the interior of the US Capitol building, again, Corinthian order. This would be a center of power in Washington, capital city of the US, but another would be the Supreme Court building. US Supreme Court building by the architect Cass Gilbert, who did several other buildings. The Virginia State Capitol is one of those, and again you'll see these classical elements embedded in the architecture, but there we'll see on the exterior the Corinthian order columns. Corinthian was not just referred to as the column of beauty, referred to connecting to the Virgin, and we'll have a look at that in a moment, but there also were expressions of power in that they were the most complex, delicate, expensive columns to build. So now returning to here, my hometown of Sydney, and we have, this is the Botanical Gardens here in Sydney, and this is one of the replicas of the Tragic Monument. So large scale architecture rightfully gets its due, but when it comes to influence and the effect that it has and still resonates with us to this modern day, centers of power, classical designs of building. I'm not really a favor of, not a fan of modernism. I really think the older schools of architecture, but the expense in regards to the crafts and the skills required, the number of masons, the expense of extracting and moving and carving these stones, it's you know, that age is effectively over. Might return hopefully one day in the future, but we live in a period of steel, glass and concrete at the moment. This of course is a sandstone replica, not a pentelic marble. People pay a fortune for marble countertops in kitchens or coffee tables. When you look at the Mohs scale of hardness in regards to marble, it doesn't speak anywhere near to the truth of the hardness of the stone. But marble, apart from being quite hard in that it's hard to work, not hard in relative terms on Mohs scale, is also a very beautiful stone. So the Parthenon and these other marble columns were very, very expensive and very difficult to carve. Doesn't matter what tool you're using, even if you're using the most modern hardened steel, marble is quite a difficult stone to work with. But we also see, you can pause this along the way and read the description, how the Tragic Monument had to do with a victory in a competition, and very highly prized in drama and art, was just as prized in competition back in the day as was sports. And again, the old Olympics actually included artistic elements in the competition. But this would refer back to the esoteric organizations and the more mysterious organizations, the modern mystery schools in that sense. And there we see a tracing board, we see the three columns, and on the right hand side of this particular one we see the Corinthian order column. This is a revolving animation of course, but that's an idea of the delicate difficulty to carve these types of columns, makes them very expensive. It's also worth looking at, again in the esoteric world, is the broken column and the connection to the Weeping Virgin. The Corinthian column in its origins is connected to the Virgin and to death as well. I'll have a look at that in a moment. But you might have seen these particular images where we see the Weeping Virgin with the acacia branch there with Saturn behind. This is another classical example, but you'll notice that the broken column is always a broken Corinthian column. There would be another example of this. In the last 150 years, there's been a movement, not a movement, it's hard to describe exactly what's going on, but definitely the Weeping Virgin is holding the acacia branch, which is connected to the legend of Hiram Abiff. However, I have noticed there has been the true nature of the Corinthian column, and the broken column is not acacia, it's the broken Corinthian column, and that connects to another plant, very important one. which is literally the leaf which is embedded into the Corinthian order column. And that's, acacia is important, but what seems to have been written out of history is the importance of the acanthus leaf. But the broken column, the broken Corinthian column, and the connection to esoterica in general, and best exemplified because it's so famous is the connection to the Freemasons. Now, before we go into that, it'd be worth looking at the origin story of the Corinthian order, the Corinthian capital. In the 10 books of architecture by the famous Roman architect engineer Vitruvius, he relates, he goes through the various columns and describes their origins, their proportions, their elements, and it's actually not just columns, even those trapezoidal doors and their proportions in regards to Doric, Ionic, Corinthian. But he also tells the story from based on earlier texts on the origin of the Corinthian capital. The Corinthian column is called the column of beauty, connected to the maiden or the virgin. So as the story goes, a young virgin, a maiden who just reached marriage age, suddenly died, and then her nurse took all her favoured belongings and placed them in what's referred to as a crater. So it's basically a basket which looks like an upside down bell. Into this basket, the nurse of the young virgin placed all her favourite belongings, and then on top of that she placed a roof tile so that this was above her grave, so that the belongings of a girl would last a little bit longer, rather than get washed out and rained out. What the nurse who had placed this didn't realise was that underneath this crater, this basket, was an acanthus root, and that's the plant which exemplifies the Corinthian order of architecture. And so this basket with the belongings had a roof tile placed on top. Winter gave way to spring, and then the acanthus root buried beneath this crater re-emerged, and the shape of the basket forced the acanthus leaves to curl and to follow the form of the basket and to curl, and creating this unique shape with the roof tile on top, and then the shape of the capital following the basket and the acanthus leaves following those. As the story goes, the Greek architect, designer, artist Callimachus come along, and he saw this particular form where these leaves were curling in and around the shape of a basket, and from that he designed the Corinthian order capital, the last of the three Greek orders of architecture to be introduced. So, and still to this day, acanthus is connected to as a funerary plant, but it's also connected to rejuvenation. So as the young girl died, the acanthus re-emerged and created something from that, and rebirth. That's one of the connections with the acanthus plant and the Corinthian column. When it comes to the development of the Greek Corinthian order of architecture, best exemplified by column capitals, it's not just the importance it had to the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, because the Romans developed and used these styles. This is a Corinthian capital from the State Library, New South Wales, here in Sydney. But it's also how the Greek Corinthian influenced later civilizations such as the Kushan Empire and what's called Greco-Buddhist architecture, where we see a Corinthian column but with a Buddha in the middle. This is from Gandhara in India. Again, we see all the elements of Corinthian order capital, but again with the Buddha in the center. And here's another example. So plainly there was an Eastern influence on the ancient Greeks. We can see that, for instance, in the philosophy of Pythagoras, who was about reincarnation and many aspects which are unusual for that time in Greece, but very connected to Eastern tradition, especially Buddhism. There was actually a movement, I think it was a fourth, not long after Buddhism began in the East, there was a strong movement to convert ancient Greece, or at least portions of it, into Buddhism itself. Very interesting factor, but we see that earlier one culture, people's influences another, and then that culture later influences those who influence them. And this would be connected to what we're about to look at now. We're in Centennial Park here in Sydney, and there are a collection of columns which have Malorium atoms basically on the top, which are nice tips of a hat to essentially the quadrivium and art and literature and science. But what's unique well, what's special, not unique about these columns is that they are of the Corinthian order. They are actually of the Tower of the Winds Corinthian order. So we have these curled acanthus at the bottom, but on the top of the capital we don't have those volutes. What we have is actually an Egyptian style. What we see is a fusion of the Greek Corinthian with the older Egyptian influence, especially the lotus plant, the lotus being the symbol of Upper Egypt. This is another one of those columns in Centennial Park. It's been parts of it have been restored, so you can see the colour variation in there as well. But now we'll see again another example. So around the bottom of that column capital, we see those curled leaves. They're uniquely distinct, distinctly acanthus. But above those, we see the lotus column. So the Greeks in the Tower of the Winds order of Corinthian reincorporated Egyptian influence, and the Tower of the Winds was a temple of timekeeping, and that would be a nice link because Sheshet and Thoth especially being the gods of timekeeping, weights and measure, science, and science in general. This is on Elizabeth Street, Sydney, the MUIOOF building, the Manchester Unity Independent Order of Oddfellows, fraternal organisation, mutual aid society, very similar to the Freemasons. Another example of this order would be the Druids building in Melbourne, but there's quite a few here around Sydney and Australia. But again, where we see the basic element of the acanthus plant being one of the defining aspects of Corinthian order architecture, but again where we see the lotus blooming above, so that's on the interior. So we see the pilasters there. It's just but you can see the red part of that pilaster, this half column square on the inside, is the acanthus, but above it we see the lotus influence. So these fusions of style with the acanthus above, the very Greek, and the acanthus below, and above it this lotus style. So on the left hand side we see the Tower of the Winds Corinthian. On the right hand side, the more traditional Corinthian style, such as seen in the Tragic Monument or the Temple of Olympian Zeus, such as Hadrian's buildings. Again, on the left, Tower of the Winds. On the right, the more conventional Corinthian style of architecture. And that brings us to the Tower of the Winds. I mentioned that the Tragic Monument, the Tower of the Winds are small in comparison and so overlooked, but the Tower of the Winds is also known as the Horologion, which means timekeeping. So horologium is also a constellation. It's drawn as a clock. But one of the purposes of the Tower of the Winds had sundials and other instruments of timekeeping. But here from the Tower of the Winds we can see these Tower of the Winds capitals and how they compare to this form of style, such as those in Centennial Park in Sydney. And timekeeping, Thoth, Sheshet, Hermes, gods of weights and measures. You measure time as well, so that would be and measuring time is very ethereal, as we're measuring length or weight is a little bit more easy. But also we see the Tower of the Winds and its location, so we see there the Acropolis in the background, and on top of that of course would be the Parthenon. But as a timekeeping temple, an interesting feature of the Tower of the Winds is still on the inside of the floor we see the traces left of this particular timekeeping mechanism. There was water attached to the temple to power a water clock, referred to as clepsydra. Now the early water clock was just a jar full of water. You'd empty the hole. When the water ran out of a hole, time was over. But other architects such as Sebius, engineers, developed a much more elaborate water clock with gears and other mechanisms very reminiscent of the Antikythera mechanism of the time. So the level of technology, and clearly there was something, it wasn't just a plain old-fashioned water jug with a hole in it to allow the water out. There was some sort of more complex timekeeping machine here in the Tower of the Winds, which would also make it stand out for good reason. But the Tower of the Winds Corinthian capital, again we see it again, the canvas around the bottom and these features. I'll link a recent video I did in the description, which I went through Egyptian columns, looked at like in India, Persia, Greece, and all the way up to the Gothic period, where a column will actually tell you quite a bit about, usually just by looking at it, you know where it comes from, and depending on the style, it also will tell you when it was made. So where and when will give you a lot of information in there. For instance, the papyrus themed columns, papyrus being the symbol of Lower Egypt, which is up the delta, and we also saw the lotus column, and the connection between the lotus and the papyrus being a constant symbol, because they also, just like the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, the lotus and the papyrus are also symbols of Lower and Upper Egypt. And there, if you can see the way that the lotus plant opens and how that would be a nice illustration to those Tower of the Winds capitals. But lotus bud is another style of capital, and so you see in Egyptian lotus, papyrus, and palm leaf features. Also, I would suspect that there is partly an element of these palm leaf column capitals also being stylistically an influence in regards to the Tower of the Winds, although it's palm leaf capitals always have a curvy top, but those Tower of the Winds capitals have a point at they are lotus, but there is I think a bit of influence in there as well. But also in regards to the development of the Corinthian capital, if we look for instance here, the image where we have at the corners of these Egyptian column capitals, we also have those volutes, those curls, those swirls, which are very, very reminiscent, if not essentially identical to the Corinthian Order of Architecture. Here we see one of the Corinthian columns from the US Capitol building, and as with all Corinthian, we see those volutes which closely match in form and style the Egyptian bell cap. But it's the lotus column and the lotus symbolism which is very important, because it does form a very interesting link between Greeks, the Greco-Buddhist architecture as it's called, and of course with Egyptian symbols, mythology, practice, and ritual. So there we see again once more the Tower of the Winds form. There we see a Tower of the Winds column, but also I'm pretty sure they're pilasters, where it's a square sort of block built into the wall. We see the traditional Corinthian style, as in the tragic monument of Lysocrates, and here is one, the example showed earlier from the State Library here in Sydney. But there we see a comparison of those two forms. They're both Corinthian. The one on the right, the tragic monument, is your traditional Corinthian style. Also, there are slight variations and evolutions during the Greek period and the Roman period, but the one on the right is Corinthian. The one on the left is Tower of Winds Corinthian, and that stands out. However, even this form closely matches the legend in regards to Callimachus and the crater, the jar where the young virgin died, and then the jar with her favourite possessions, roof tile placed on top, and then from beneath an acanthus plant grew out. So even the Tower of the Winds form does match the fabled origins, as they call it, of Callimachus and the Corinthian order. Here we see an image showing the evolution of the Corinthian order, the variations and styles and developments within that. Now there's also Roman composite, which is a more elaborate Corinthian, but the importance of the Tower of the Winds style and how that compares, and once more the inspiration, how the Egyptian bell cap and those the form, but the volutes, those swirls at the corners, how they are also part of the Corinthian order. So there you can see a comparison. The tragic monument, that's of course image is a replica, and but again the volutes, which have the importance of movement through time, but also across cultural references and how things in a pendulum form swing back. Of course, the base of all Tower of Winds Corinthian show that classical acanthus design, which is the basis of the origin of the Corinthian order, and therefore that swirl, those plants, those leaves that you see in traditional Corinthian are also in there. But what's interesting, what separates the Tower of the Winds is they do not have the volute form. What they have is a lotus, an Egyptian form of the top half of those capitals, which is interesting again because of a connection to Buddhism. I mentioned earlier, Buddhism almost become the state religion of Greece. In Pythagoras philosophy, you can see this influence in there, but the lotus being very important in Buddhism. However, Greco-Buddhist architecture, especially in the Kushan Empire and Gandhara, they incorporated the traditional Corinthian and simply have a Buddha placed there in the center. So from Egypt to Greece, and from India to Greece, and then from Greece back to Egypt, and from Greece influencing the Buddhist forms of sculpture and architecture. There is a tendency to look at that each culture, whether it's Greeks or even Hindu, Buddhist, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, there is a tendency to look at them separately as if they developed entirely independently. This, of course, is not the mainstream view, but it is a sort of like a normal view. But whether it's focus on my channel, I really love ancient weights and measures. I think that they show one of the best examples of this transmission of knowledge from culture to culture, also painting a picture that even Old Kingdom Egypt and the Indus Valley, the comparisons between those in a measurable way show an extraordinary symphony of coincidence, or that there is the transmission of knowledge, information, philosophy goes back quite some time. And so columns are not just pure decoration, randomly sort of placed. They have stories, mythology, connections, proportions, and that's another interesting thing when it comes to columns. For instance, in Vitruvius, or even later Palladio and later architects in the Renaissance with the classical revival, they speak, it's very important that your column be so high and so wide, and that the height of the capital be in such a relationship to the width of the column to create these things. It's not just random about placing them. They do more than hold things up, but this influence can also be seen, for instance, in the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and where we can see, well, there are actually even Ionic influences, but here in the hall we also have the Corinthian style of architecture. Very early mosques would often take older columns, Roman columns, and use them to build. But even once they start completely from scratch with their own columns and sculptors and stonemasons working, they incorporated these much older architectural principles. And for instance, they found the oldest surviving Quran, and a large part of that book was actually on architecture and how to design and build and proportions of those. And we can see that, of course, in the beautiful architecture such as in the Alhambra, the Blue Mosque in Istanbul and other places. But there has been a transfer, and it is evident, it can be seen. And of course, as with these columns here in Sydney, whether it's London, Paris, New York, any other major city of the world, the influence, the omnipresence, the importance of these schools and forms and the ancients developed them because they're also beautiful to the eye, but they also embed, of course, information, not just in terms of mythology, but again in proportion and measurement and the mathematics behind architecture. So columns do a lot more than just hold things up. They're a lot more than just being pretty. They actually do contain important information. With that, hope you enjoyed. There'll be links to related videos in the description. SGD, have a good one.